Hello, everyone. Welcome back once again to our discussion of a Kantian approach to famine relief. In this video, we are going to pick up where we left off, but now we're going to dig into the details more specifically regarding this paper by Honora O'Neill, A Kantian Approach to Famine Relief, which you should have read for this module. So we're going to kind of build upon what we have been discussing with regard to what exactly it means to have a moral obligation to help those in need. That duty, that obligation should be interpreted as saying that we have a responsibility to help with regard to some subset of serious harms. But since we also have a duty to ourselves, since we are rational agents as well as other people, then we need to take our own decisions, our own rational autonomy into consideration when we're making those sorts of choices. And we're thinking about what it means to have a duty to help those that are suffering and experiencing poverty or living in famine. So that's what we're going to do now for this particular video. And since O'Neill is taking a Kantian approach, then let's begin by just reminding ourselves what the different formulations of the categorical imperative actually say. According to the first formulation, which is oftentimes referred to as the principle of law or perhaps a universalizability, this formulation says, act according to a maxim whereby you can at this very same time will that it should become a universal law. And according to the second formulation, which is oftentimes called the principle of humanity, this principle says that we should always treat other rational agents, including oneself, as an end and never as a mere means to an end. Or another way of putting that is we should never treat rational agents as mere tools or objects to be used. People are rational agents, not resources to be exploited. And I just want to mention here that O'Neill calls this formulation the formulation of ends in itself. And that's because we should treat all rational agents, including ourselves, as an end in itself, never as a mere means to an end. So those are the two formulations as we generally think of them of the categorical imperative. Now, I'm going to largely ignore the sorts of arguments that somebody might offer in support of either one of these interpretations or formulations of the categorical imperative, because instead I want to focus on what O'Neill says in regard to this Kantian approach to famine relief. So, as I already mentioned, O'Neill's taken specifically a Kantian approach, which seems, according to O'Neill, to be a better solution to famine relief. On this perspective, this is going to help sort of thread the needle for the problem of famine relief. Indeed, O'Neill thinks that Kant actually does provide a good reason for why we are morally obligated, why we have a duty, why we're morally required to help those who are experiencing famine. And this is essentially based upon the principle of beneficence, which is this idea of having a duty to do good, to help others. Yet, at the same time, it's not just this principle of beneficence that we should keep in mind. We should also pay close attention to Kant's view of justice. This principle of justice is going to play a key role as well. But as we saw in the previous video lecture, according to this Kantian approach, we also get a reason for why we're free to choose the manner or the way in which we help, right? So we might have a duty to help, but we get to decide whether or not we're going to help by donating money to those starving children on the other side of the world, or whether we're going to go to the soup kitchen, or whether we might choose to donate our time and our resources and our money maybe in some other way. Since we are rational agents, we need to respect our own rational agency, which means that we have to take into consideration in a number of different ways in which we might actually fulfill this duty. So, to put that point a bit differently, we have autonomy to choose what good acts to perform, which is just to say that we have a duty to do something good, but what exactly we do is open for us to decide with respect to our own individual free choice in the matter. All right, so let's turn our attention to the principle of beneficence in a bit more detail. Right, so remember, beneficence, according to Kant, is to have a kind of an attitude of goodwill towards humanity, humanity as a whole, all rational agents, including ourselves. Beneficence tells us that we should want to help those who we can help when we can help. Indeed, for Kant, this means that we must work to try and increase a person's well-being. We must do what we can to provide the means to help those who are in need. Indeed, we must help others to achieve their ends. So, if your end is to get a degree, and that means to do well in this class, then my duty to help you in regard to beneficence is to help you achieve that goal of getting a good grade in this class and accomplishing your goal of getting your degree from this university. And that means that essentially we need to help others to achieve what it is that they value. If you value getting a degree and doing well in this class, then a part of my duty with regard to beneficence is to help you achieve what it is you value. Indeed, we have a duty to help others to pursue their own rational choices. Or another way to put that is that we must help others to realize and express their own rational autonomy, such that when I fail to do these things, then I'm violating this principle of beneficence. In some regard, I'm not living up to what's expected of me with regard to having an attitude of goodwill towards all rational agents or to all of humanity, according to Kant. But we should keep in mind that for Kant, this principle of beneficence is really an imperfect duty to be beneficent. It's an imperfect duty insofar as it allows us some leeway to decide how to fulfill this duty. It's not telling us that you must do X. Rather, it tells us you have a duty to have this attitude of beneficence where it can be fulfilled in a number of different ways, and that's left to us to decide how to fulfill it. So that means then that we have an obligation to help every rational human to act in line with beneficence. Yet, at the same point, given that beneficence is understood as an imperfect duty according to Kant, then insofar as we have a rational autonomy ourselves, well, then this means that we have a duty towards ourselves also. So then here's the way that O'Neill puts this point. Quote, "We cannot seek everything that others want. Their wants are too numerous and diverse and, of course, sometimes incompatible. It follows that beneficence has to be selective, which, of course, is why it's up to us to make a decision with regard to how we fulfill this imperfect duty of beneficence, or to help others achieve their own values and their own goals, to have an attitude of goodwill towards all of humanity. So that's what we mean here by a principle of beneficence and why it counts as an imperfect duty. Now let's turn our attention to the principle of justice according to what Kant has to say. According to Kant and the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant says, quote, "Any action is just if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with a universal law." So justice here is a kind of perfect duty. And what that means is it's telling us that we have an obligation to refrain from doing certain things. It's not a positive command to do something else. Rather, it's a kind of prohibition, right? So we are prohibited from doing things that might be considered inconsistent with the universal law or a violation of the categorical imperative, right? If it's not able to coexist with everybody else's freedom, then it violates the universal law, and therefore we have an obligation not to do that thing. Right, so that's what we mean here by a perfect duty. And so, with regard to justice, according to Kant, we can never treat a rational person as a mere means to some other end. This then leads to his prohibition on certain unjust acts. And again, we can consider how O'Neill puts this point. O'Neill says, quote, "Kantians will claim that they have done nothing wrong if none of their acts is unjust, and that their duty is complete if, in addition to their life plans, they have been reasonably beneficent." End quote. Well, of course, that is to say that that their choices has been such that they have an attitude of goodwill towards all of humanity, and they are helping others achieve their own ends and their own goals in life. However, we need to be careful here, because if we pay close attention to what justice actually requires of us, then it might become clear that according to Kant's view, this form of justice actually is very radical. It's going to demand a kind of change in the way that we are interacting with society. It might demand a kind of change in our current social and political as well as economic systems. So, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, according to Kant, justice, if we're thinking of justice as a perfect duty, which requires that we never act unjustly towards others, those who maybe are living in famine, let's say, or starving children on the other side of the world, then we need to make sure that we're not engaging with practices or organizations or companies or maybe governments that are contributing to this issue, to this problem. Yet, what exactly does that mean? How should we understand this notion, this principle of justice as a perfect duty? Well, this part of the lecture might seem a little controversial, yet at the same point, it looks kind of like Kant's approach to justice. It sort of sounds quite a bit like socialism. Indeed, O'Neill applies the previous tools that we were considering specifically to famine, right? So the following actions would be unjust and so would be morally prohibited according to this kind of Kantian approach to justice as a perfect duty. So let's consider what sort of prohibitions we might have in mind, and at the same point, whether or not you and I are currently participating in these sorts of practices in our current situation, our current society. So, what sort of actions do we have in mind here? Well, according to Kant's view of justice as a perfect duty, which is a kind of prohibition, well, then this means that we are morally required never to cheat a rational scheme. So, what does that mean? Well, when rational agents are engaged in some practice and we deceive or we withhold information, then we are cheating a rational scheme. We are causing people to make choices without the information that they need. That is, the information that's needed in order to make a fully informed and autonomous choice for themselves. Likewise, we're morally required to never engage in practices of hoarding money, hoarding food or goods or other forms of private property. And for Kant, we are morally required to never exploit the famine victims for financial benefit. And we're morally required never to obtain political advantages from famine victims. Likewise, we're morally required never to disadvantage famine victims in exchange for their help. And we're morally required never to use one's influence in a way that might disadvantage others. And we're morally required to never to enter into an agreement, either explicit or implicit, with those who violate any of the above requirements, which is basically, if you think about it, just another way of saying that we're morally required never to do business with anyone that violates the above, that violates any of these sorts of moral requirements. But notice that this is exactly what we see in a capitalist society like our own. Our own society often uses some form of cheating method. Maybe that's with regard to labeling or different sorts of commercials involving some sort of irrational scheme like the marketplace. Right? This is exactly what happens when you turn on the TV or you're online. You're constantly seeing commercials which are essentially lying to you, cheating an irrational scheme. And I can't even begin to get into the different cases of hoarding money, food and goods and private property that are taking place in a society like our own, or the exploitation of famine victims for financial benefit, or obtaining political advantages from famine victims. All sorts of different issues like these are clearly happening in our capitalist society today. So, according to Kant's approach here, it looks like we're morally required to never to enter into any kind of an agreement with these sorts of organizations or governments or aspects of our society. We're morally required never to do business with anyone who violates these sorts of moral requirements, which means that it looks like we're doing something morally wrong whenever we buy products from companies that are engaged in these sorts of practices, engaged in this kind of capitalistic uh, uh, influence on our society. So while on the one hand, I think that there's a really interesting and important aspect of Kant's approach that allows us the freedom and the autonomy to make a decision on how we are going to obtain and carry out the moral obligation that we have to help people. This is the principle of beneficence. Yet at the same point, the principle of justice looks very, very demanding, kind of similar to what we saw with regard to Singer's argument. But let's do a little bit more to dig into how justice applies in the case of famine itself, a little more specifically. Clearly, justice demands that we help those victims that are suffering right next to us, people that are living in poverty, the starving children that are close by, or right here in our own society. But what about those who are suffering on the other side of the world? Because remember, that was a key aspect of Singer's argument, where he said that we needed to provide support, financial support to help those who are starving, those children starving on the other side of the world, not just in our own backyard. So then, what does Kantian view have to say about these individuals? It certainly seems worth asking, worth wondering whether Kantian deontology implies that we do not actually have a moral obligation to help those who are far away from us, or that we can do whatever we want regarding those who are far away from us, as long as we have good intentions, let's say. We might want to help, nonetheless, we're just not going to. Is this going to provide us a kind of a justified excuse or some sort of an escape clause that allows us to get out of this problem? Well, the answer is no, it doesn't. In fact, once again, it seems like Kant's view is very demanding after all, right? When it comes to those who are suffering from famine and poverty, even though they might be far away from us, here's the sorts of things that we must keep in mind, which a Kantian view of justice is going to require of us. We should not deceive ourselves, right? Because we ourselves are rational agents also, so we have a duty to our own respect our own rational agency. So we cannot deceive ourselves. We should not engage in the deception of others, right? So we can't engage in practices that are going to misinform or withhold information from other people. We should not engage in things like coercion, whether that might be directly or indirectly via an economic system that we happen to live in and participate in, namely our own capitalistic society. So the problem is that according to this Kantian view of justice, we all live in a capitalist society that prima facie seems to violate this view of justice. Each of us have to wrestle with this fact, and it's not immediately clear how we should respond to this point. So then the question that we are faced with is simply, what should we do? Well, I think one thing that we can say is that we are definitely morally obligated to help people who are experiencing famine. We are obligated to help with regard to famine relief, but we also have our own rational autonomy to consider. Right? So, unlike Singer's prescription, we can choose the way in which we want to help. Which way are we going to fulfill this particular duty of beneficence in times of famine? But notice that we are still morally required. We can't just decide not to do anything at all. According to Kantian deontology, we value autonomy and life greatly. And O'Neill stresses this point, right? O'Neill argues that if we are following Kant's deontological approach, then this should naturally lead us to choosing to act to help others. We should be naturally inclined to help with regard to famine relief. So then another way to put this is it's not adequately beneficent to do a minimal action merely to kind of check off a box saying, well, I fulfilled my moral obligation. No, that's not going to be enough according to Kantian deontology. Because remember, Kantian deontology is a form of non-consequentialism. So it's not actually the consequences that matter. Rather, it's acting in accordance with a categorical imperative, having the right intentions, doing what is right because it's right, because we're respecting one's rational agency and we're treating rational agents as ends and never as mere means to an end, right? That's the point of Kantian deontology. So it's not the consequences that matter, but it's acting for the right reasons that matters. It's having the right good intentions that really matters, according to Kant. Hence, the reasons why we help those who are suffering from famine and people living in poverty, starving on the other side of the world, The reason why we help is not merely the consequences of our actions, right? No, the reasons why we're going to help is because of our intentions. We want to do good. We want to help those. We want to be beneficent to all of humanity. Indeed, we want to respect everyone's autonomous choice. We want to naturally respect the personhood and one's ability to give their fully informed consent or perhaps not to consent to various things. That is, we want to help everyone achieve their own goals and their own ends, even if they're living in famine. Indeed, this is just what it means to treat them as ends in themselves and not merely as a kind of a tool to get whatever it is that we want. Maybe, for instance, some coffee or some new shoes or maybe a new car. Right? That would be treating people living in poverty and famine as a tool to get what we want. Right? So, according to this approach, when we do the bare minimum work, we're using other people, other rational agents, as a mere means to our end, whatever that end might happen to be. So, we cannot just simply say or claim to ourselves, we can't deceive ourselves into thinking that we have good intentions, yet at the same time, we're not going to do anything to actually help. Right? That would violate both the principle of beneficence as well as the principle of justice. Indeed, that would be a form of self-deception. We would be deceiving ourselves as well as others. So then we are morally required both with regard to beneficence and with regard to justice. So while clearly, according to Kant, it is up to us to decide how we're going to help, right? We can choose how that's going to happen. Still, we must actually help, and we should want to do this. It should naturally flow from our beneficence. So then, if we end up doing the bare minimum, or if we do nothing at all, then this would be kind of like evidence that we don't actually have good intentions in the first place. So, to wrap things up, then, we can't simply say that we have good intentions and then turn around and do whatever we want, where doing whatever we want amounts to doing the bare minimum or nothing at all. All right. Now, in the next video, we're going to consider in more detail Pollen's in Defense of Food, I believe it's chapter 3 and 4. Nutritionism comes to market and food science's golden age, where we're going to look at and think about how a capitalist society like our own really does seem to violate some of these basic principles, namely the principle of justice according to Kantian deontological approach to food justice. So that's what I want you to turn to next.